The old pickup truck coughed and wheezed as it turned off the main road onto the gravel driveway. Dust clouds followed behind like a loyal dog as the vehicle made its way through the rusty iron gates. The driver, a man in his late 30s with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Home at last. David Rodriguez had been gone for almost 4 months this time. His consulting work took him all over the country, and while the travel paid well, nothing beat the feeling of coming back to his grandfather's old ranch. The 40 acres of rolling hills and oak trees had been in his family for 3 generations, long before the fancy subdivision grew up around it like mushrooms after rain. He parked near the old barn and stepped out, his work boots hitting the dirt with a satisfying crunch. The air smelled like hay and wildflowers, mixed with that particular scent of home that you can't find anywhere else. David stretched his arms above his head, working out the kinks from hours of driving. His jeans were faded, his flannel shirt had seen better days, and his baseball cap was so worn the logo had nearly disappeared. The ranch house sat about 50 yards away, a modest 2-story building with a wraparound porch that had probably seen a million sunsets. It wasn't much to look at compared to the McMansions that surrounded the property, but it was solid and real in a way those cookie-cutter houses could never be. David grabbed his duffel bag from the truck bed and headed toward the house, already thinking about a cold beer and a hot shower. That's when he noticed her. A woman was standing at the property line, hands on her hips, staring at him like he'd just committed a crime. She looked to be in her early 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Her workout clothes were the kind you saw in expensive boutiques, and her sneakers looked like they'd never touched actual dirt. She started walking toward him with purpose, and David could tell by her expression that this wasn't going to be a friendly welcome to the neighborhood. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You can't be here. This is private property." David stopped walking and turned to face her, setting his bag down. "Actually, ma'am, this is my property. I live here." The woman's eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down, taking in his dusty clothes and worn boots. "I don't think so. I've been keeping an eye on this place for months and nobody lives here. Are you some kind of squatter?" "No, I'm not a squatter," David said, keeping his voice calm and even. "My name is David Rodriguez and I own this ranch. I've been away on business, but the woman wasn't listening. She'd already pulled out her phone and was scrolling through her contacts. I'm calling the police. We don't tolerate this kind of thing in our community." "This is a respectable neighborhood," David sighed. He'd dealt with difficult people before, but this was a new one. "Look, Mrs. Whitmore, Barbara Whitmore. I'm the head of the Neighborhood Watch Committee, and I know every person who belongs in this area." "You don't." Barbara was already dialing, her manicured fingers moving quickly over the screen. David could see there was no point in trying to reason with her right now. Some people made up their minds about things and wouldn't let facts get in the way. "Hello, 911. I need to report a trespasser," Barbara said into the phone, never taking her eyes off David. "Yes, there's a suspicious man on the abandoned property on Meadowbrook Lane. He claims he owns it, but that's obviously not true." David shook his head and walked back to his truck to get his paperwork. He kept all his property documents in the glove compartment for situations exactly like this. Well, maybe not exactly like this. He'd never had someone call the cops on him for coming home before. As he rifled through the papers, he could hear Barbara giving a detailed description of him to the police dispatcher. According to her version, he was a potentially dangerous individual who was clearly up to no good. She made it sound like he was carrying weapons and planning to rob the place. The truth was, David was about as dangerous as a golden retriever. He spent his days helping communities solve their problems, not creating them. But try explaining that to someone who'd already decided you were a criminal. Within minutes, he could hear sirens in the distance. Barbara stood with her arms crossed, looking satisfied with herself. She'd probably imagined this moment, playing out scenarios where she single-handedly protected the neighborhood from undesirable elements. 2 police cars pulled up to the property, their lights flashing. 4 officers got out, and David could see they were approaching the situation carefully. They didn't know what they were walking into, and Barbara's dramatic phone call had probably made it sound more serious than it was. "Are you the property owner?" the first officer asked David. "Yes, sir. David Rodriguez. I have all my paperwork right here." David handed over his driver's license, property deed, and tax records. The officer looked over the documents while his partner kept an eye on Barbara, who was clearly itching to add her commentary to the situation. "These look legitimate," the officer said after a few minutes. "The address matches and everything appears to be in order." Barbara's confident expression started to crack. But he can't possibly own this place. Look at him. Look at this property. It's a disaster. No respectable person would let their land look like this." The second officer turned to Barbara. "Ma'am, if he has the proper documentation proving ownership, then he has every right to be on his own property." "This doesn't make sense," Barbara sputtered. "I've been watching this place for months. It's been empty. And look at the state of it. The grass is too long, there are weeds everywhere, and that barn is falling apart. It's bringing down all our property values." David bit back a smile. His grandfather would have laughed at the idea that a little tall grass was some kind of crisis. The old man had believed in letting the land breathe, in working with nature instead of fighting it every step of the way. "Ma'am," the first officer said patiently, "as long as Mr. Rodriguez isn't violating any laws, he's free to maintain his property as he sees fit." Barbara looked like she'd swallowed something sour. "What about HOA regulations? Surely there are standards that have to be maintained." "This property predates the HOA," David said quietly. "It's specifically exempted from the covenants." The look on Barbara's face was priceless. She'd been so sure of herself, so certain that she was in the right. Now she was learning that the law wasn't on her side, and neither were the facts. The officers finished their report and prepared to leave. As they walked back to their cars, Barbara stood there looking deflated, like a balloon that had lost most of its air. David picked up his duffel bag and headed toward the house again. He'd lost his enthusiasm for that cold beer, but he was more determined than ever to enjoy his time at home. After all, it was his land, his legacy, and his right to be there. Barbara watched him go, her mind already working on what to do next. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, David woke up to the sound of hammering. He rolled out of bed and looked out his bedroom window to see what was going on. There, right at his property line, Barbara Whitmore was installing a security camera on a tall metal pole. David pulled on his jeans and walked outside, coffee mug in hand. The morning air was crisp and he could hear birds singing in the oak trees. It would have been peaceful if not for the sound of Barbara's enthusiastic hammering. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he called out. "What you doing there?" Barbara looked up from her work, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. "I'm installing a surveillance system to monitor this property. Since the police won't do anything about suspicious activity, I'll have to handle it myself." David took a sip of his coffee and watched her struggle with the camera mount. "That camera is pointing directly at my house." "It's on my property line," Barbara said defensively. "I have every right to protect my investment." "Actually, you don't have the right to record my private property without permission," David said mildly. "That's against the law in this state." Barbara stopped hammering and glared at him. "Don't try to intimidate me with your legal mumbo-jumbo." "I know my rights," David shrugged. "Just letting you know. Have a nice day." He went back inside, but he could still hear her working out there. By the time he finished his breakfast, she'd managed to get the camera operational and was adjusting the angle to get the best view of his front yard. Around noon, David decided to work on fixing the fence near the barn. It was honest work that kept his hands busy and his mind clear. He'd been at it for about an hour when a car pulled up his driveway. Two people got out, a man and a woman in official-looking clothes carrying clipboards. "Mr. Rodriguez?" the woman called out. "We're from the County Code Enforcement Office. We received a complaint about potential violations on your property." David set down his hammer and walked over to them. "What kind of violations?" The man consulted his clipboard. "Overgrown vegetation, unsecured structures, and potential health hazards. We need to do an inspection." David knew exactly who had filed the complaint, but he didn't say anything. "Sure, go ahead and look around. I'll answer any questions you have." For the next hour, the inspectors walked around his property, taking notes and photos. They checked the barn, looked at the vegetable garden his grandfather had planted, and measured the height of the grass in various spots. "Everything looks fine to me," the woman said finally. "The vegetation is within acceptable limits. The structures are sound, and I don't see any health hazards. Whoever filed this complaint might have unrealistic expectations about rural property maintenance." David thanked them, and watched them drive away. Through his kitchen window, he could see Barbara in her backyard, probably watching the whole thing through binoculars. That afternoon, things got more interesting. David was replacing some boards on his front porch when a van pulled up. Meadowbrook Pest Control was painted on the side in bright green letters. The driver got out and looked around confused. "I'm here for the emergency pest control service. Someone called about a rodent infestation." "Nobody called from here," David said. "But let me guess, a Mrs. Whitmore made the appointment?" The pest control guy checked his paperwork. "Yeah, that's right. She said the property next door was overrun with rats and it was threatening the whole neighborhood." David almost laughed. "Well, you're welcome to look around, but I think you'll find that Mrs. Whitmore might have exaggerated the situation." 20 minutes later, the pest control van drove away without doing any work. The driver had found exactly zero evidence of any rodent problem. By evening, David had received visits from animal control, complaint about dangerous wildlife, the fire department, report of illegal burning, and a representative from the health department, anonymous tip about contaminated water. All of them found nothing wrong. David was sitting on his porch at sunset, trying to enjoy the peace and quiet, when Barbara appeared at his property line again. This time she had a clipboard of her own and what looked like a measuring tape. "What are you up to now?" David asked. "I'm documenting code violations for my complaint to the county," Barbara announced. "That fence is clearly not up to standard. Your grass exceeds the allowable height, and I'm pretty sure that barn violates several building codes." David stood up and walked over to where she was standing. "Mrs. Whitmore, can I ask you something?" "What? Why does this matter so much to you?" "I mean, what I do with my property doesn't really affect you, does it?" Barbara's face flushed red. "Of course it affects me. Do you have any idea what properties like yours do to neighborhood values? I've worked my whole life to afford a home in a nice area, and I'm not going to let some what?" David asked quietly. Barbara realized she was about to say something she might regret. "Some person who doesn't care about maintaining standards ruin it for everyone else." "I see," David said. "And you think you know what's best for everyone?" "I know what's best for property values," Barbara shot back. "This isn't some rural farmland anymore. This is a respectable suburban community with standards." "Those standards didn't exist when my grandfather built this place," David pointed out. "He was here first." "Times change," Barbara said. "People need to adapt or move somewhere more suitable to their lifestyle." David could see there was no point in continuing the conversation. Barbara had made up her mind about him and his property, and facts weren't going to change it. "Well, you have a good evening, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, turning to go back to his house. "This isn't over," Barbara called after him. "I'm going to make sure this property is brought up to community standards one way or another." David went inside and made himself dinner, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Barbara was just getting started. Through his window, he could see her in her backyard, pacing back and forth while talking on her phone. Later that night, David's phone rang. It was his neighbor on the other side of the property, an elderly man named Frank who'd lived in the area for 20 years. "Hey, David, sorry to bother you," Frank said. "But I thought you should know, Barbara Whitmore has been calling around the neighborhood trying to get people to sign some kind of petition about your place." "What kind of petition?" "Something about getting the city to declare your property a nuisance and force you to clean it up. Most folks aren't interested, but she's pretty persistent." David thanked Frank and hung up. He looked out his kitchen window toward Barbara's house, where the lights were still on despite the late hour. He could see her silhouette moving around inside, probably planning her next move. David had dealt with difficult people before in his line of work, but Barbara Whitmore was in a league of her own. She wasn't just stubborn or unreasonable. She was completely convinced that she was right and everyone else was wrong. The irony wasn't lost on him. If Barbara knew what David did for a living, she'd probably faint. But for now, he was just the guy with the messy property who didn't know his place in her perfect little world. David turned off the lights and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Tomorrow would probably bring new challenges from his overzealous neighbor, and he needed to be ready for whatever she had planned next. Barbara Whitmore sat at her kitchen table at 6 in the morning, laptop open, coffee growing cold beside her. She'd been up most of the night and her eyes burned from staring at the screen, but she was determined to find something on David Rodriguez. There had to be something. People who let their property look like that always had secrets to hide. Maybe he was behind on his taxes. Maybe the property was in foreclosure. Maybe he had a criminal record. She just had to dig deep enough to find it. Barbara started with the basics. Property records showed that David Rodriguez was indeed the legal owner of the 40-acre ranch, and the taxes were current. That was disappointing, but not the end of the story. She moved on to social media. David's Facebook page was sparse, mostly photos of landscapes and the occasional picture of him fishing or hiking. No red flags there, just boring outdoor stuff. His Instagram was more of the same. Nature photos and shots of various cities he'd visited for work. Work. That was interesting. His social media mentioned business travel, but he never said what kind of work he did. Barbara pulled up LinkedIn and searched for David Rodriguez. There were dozens of them, but she finally found the right profile. What she saw made her sit back in her chair. David Rodriguez, CEO and founder of Community Solutions Group. The company description talked about consulting services for homeowner associations and community management. He had connections to hundreds of HOA professionals across the country. Barbara frowned. This didn't make sense. If David worked with HOAs, why would he let his own property look so terrible? Unless he was some kind of con artist who told people what they wanted to hear while doing the opposite himself. She clicked on his company website. Community Solutions Group offered services like HOA management, legal consulting, and community relations. Their client list included some of the largest and most prestigious communities in the state. But the more Barbara read, the more confused she became. The testimonials from clients praised David's work in resolving disputes, improving property values, and creating harmony in troubled communities. One review called him the most knowledgeable HOA consultant in the business. This had to be a mistake. The David Rodriguez who owned the messy ranch couldn't possibly be the same person these people were praising. Barbara spent the next 2 hours digging deeper. She found articles David had written for industry publications about property management and community relations. She found speaking engagements at conferences across the country. She even found a video of him giving a presentation about resolving neighbor disputes. In the video, David was wearing a nice suit and speaking to a room full of HOA board members and property managers. He looked professional and knowledgeable, nothing like the scruffy guy in work clothes she'd confronted the day before, but it was definitely him. Same face, same voice, same calm way of speaking that had annoyed her so much during their encounter. Barbara felt a knot forming in her stomach. According to everything she was reading, David Rodriguez wasn't just some random guy who worked with HOAs. He was apparently one of the most respected professionals in the entire industry. She found more articles, more speaking engagements, more client testimonials. David had helped communities resolve everything from architectural disputes to neighbor conflicts to legal challenges. His company's website featured case studies of communities that had gone from dysfunctional to harmonious under his guidance. One case study particularly caught Barbara's attention. It was about a community where residents were constantly filing complaints against each other, where neighbor disputes had gotten so bad that several families had moved away. David's company had stepped in and helped them create new communication processes and conflict resolution procedures. Within a year, the community had gone from being known as the neighborhood from hell to winning an award for community excellence. Barbara stared at the screen, her mouth dry. She thought about all the complaints she'd filed against David, all the calls she'd made to various government agencies, all the ways she'd tried to make his life difficult. And apparently, resolving exactly these kinds of conflicts was his job. She kept reading. David had written extensively about the importance of understanding different perspectives, about not making assumptions about people based on appearances, about finding common ground even in the most difficult situations. There was an interview where he talked about growing up on his grandfather's ranch and how that experience had taught him to value both tradition and progress. He spoke about the importance of preserving heritage while adapting to changing communities. Barbara felt sick. Every single thing she'd done to David was exactly the kind of behavior he helped communities overcome in his professional work. She found a recent article David had written called "When Good Neighbors Go Bad: Understanding the Root Causes of Community Conflict." As she read it, she realized he could have been writing about her specifically. The article talked about how fear and insecurity, could make people lash out at others who seemed different. It discussed how property values often became a symbol for deeper anxieties about change and control. It explained how some residents used HOA rules as weapons against neighbors they didn't understand or approve of. Barbara read the whole thing twice. It was like looking in a mirror, and she didn't like what she saw. The worst part was that David's approach to these situations was always compassionate and understanding. He didn't demonize difficult residents or dismiss their concerns. Instead, he tried to address the underlying fears and needs that drove problematic behavior. Barbara thought about how patient David had been with her, even when she'd called the police on him. He'd never raised his voice or been rude, even when she'd been completely unreasonable. She found a video interview where David talked about a particularly challenging case involving a resident who had filed dozens of complaints against neighbors for minor issues. Instead of having the person removed from the community, David had worked with them to understand their concerns and find constructive ways to address them. "Every difficult resident has a story," David said in the interview. "Usually they're acting out of fear or a sense of powerlessness. Our job isn't to punish them, but to help them find better ways to feel secure and valued in their community." Barbara closed the laptop and put her head in her hands. She'd made a terrible mistake, and the worst part was that David probably understood exactly why she'd done what she'd done. Her phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. It was her friend Carol from down the street. "Barbara, I heard you've been having issues with that ranch property," Carol said. "I just wanted to let you know my husband Tom looked into it yesterday. Apparently the owner is some kind of big shot in the HOA world. Tom thinks we should probably leave him alone." Barbara's heart sank. If word was already getting around the neighborhood about David's professional background, it would only be a matter of time before everyone knew how badly she'd handled the situation. "What exactly did Tom find out?" Barbara asked, dreading the answer. "Well, he owns one of the biggest HOA consulting companies in the country. Tom says he's like the go-to guy when communities have serious problems, really respected in the industry." Barbara thanked Carol and hung up. She sat in her kitchen, staring out the window at David's property. For the first time, instead of seeing an eyesore, she tried to see it the way David might see it. The tall grass wasn't neglect, it was natural landscape. The old barn wasn't falling down, it was weathered but sturdy. The whole place had a peaceful, established quality that her own perfectly manicured yard somehow lacked. She thought about the security camera she'd installed, still pointing at David's house. She thought about all the government agencies she'd called to complain about him. She thought about the petition she'd been trying to get neighbors to sign. Barbara Whitmore, self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, had spent the last 2 days harassing one of the most qualified people in America to judge whether her behavior was appropriate. And based on everything she'd just read, David Rodriguez would probably still try to help her if she asked. The Meadowbrook HOA board meeting was held the third Tuesday of every month in the community center, a beige building that looked like every other community center in America. Barbara Whitmore arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a manila folder thick with printed photos, property records, and a carefully prepared presentation. She'd spent 3 days putting together what she considered an airtight case against David Rodriguez. Despite her uncomfortable discovery about his professional background, Barbara had convinced herself that his reputation in the HOA world actually made his property violations worse, not better. If anything, a man in his position should be setting a better example for the community. The meeting room gradually filled with the usual suspects. There was Tom Sullivan, the HOA president, a retired engineer who ran meetings like military operations. Janet Chen sat in her usual spot near the front, armed with a notebook and color-coded pens. Bob Martinez, the treasurer, was already looking at his watch, eager to get through the agenda and get home to whatever sports game was on TV that night. Barbara had requested time to address the board about what she termed a serious threat to community standards and property values. She'd been planning this presentation for days, practicing her arguments in front of her bathroom mirror until she had them memorized. "Before we get to new business," Tom Sullivan announced, "I have an update on our ongoing legal consultation project." Barbara perked up. She hadn't heard anything about legal consultations. "As you all know," Tom continued, "we've been dealing with some challenging issues this year. The parking dispute on Elm Street, the tree trimming controversy, and that whole mess with the playground equipment specifications. I'm happy to report that our consulting advisor has helped us resolve most of these issues without expensive legal action." Barbara raised her hand. Who exactly is this consultant? Tom looked at his notes. Dr. David Rodriguez from Community Solutions Group. He's been working with us pro bono for the past 2 years. Frankly, I don't know how we would have managed some of these situations without his help. Barbara felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. She looked around the room, suddenly wondering if everyone knew something she didn't. Actually, Tom continued, David asked if he could attend tonight's meeting. He wanted to discuss some preventive measures we could implement to avoid future conflicts. He should be here any minute. Barbara's carefully planned presentation suddenly felt like a lead weight in her hands. She thought about bolting for the door, but before she could move, David Rodriguez walked into the room. He was wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, looking every inch the professional consultant. He nodded to Tom and took a seat in the back row, pulling out a legal pad and pen. Barbara stared at him, trying to reconcile this composed, professional-looking man with the guy in work boots she'd been harassing for the past week. All right, Tom said. Let's move on to new business. Barbara, I believe you had something you wanted to discuss. Barbara stood up on shaky legs. Yes, I wanted to talk about property maintenance standards in our community. She opened her folder and pulled out the photo she'd taken of David's ranch. I've been monitoring a property that I believe violates several community standards. Barbara looked back at David, who was watching her with interest but no apparent concern. He even smiled slightly and nodded encouragingly, as if he was genuinely interested in what she had to say. The property in question has overgrown vegetation, structures that appear to be in disrepair, and an overall appearance that's inconsistent with neighborhood standards. Barbara continued, her voice getting weaker with each word. Tom looked at the photos Barbara was passing around. Which property are you referring to? The ranch on Meadowbrook Lane, Barbara said quietly. Tom's eyebrows went up. You mean David's property? The room went dead silent. Barbara could feel everyone looking back and forth between her and David. She wanted to disappear. Barbara, Tom said carefully, I think there might be some confusion here. David's property predates our HOA by about 50 years. It's specifically exempted from all community covenants. But surely there are city codes, Barbara tried weakly. Actually, Janet Chen spoke up. I had the city inspector out there last week for an unrelated issue. He mentioned that someone had filed multiple complaints about the ranch property, but when he investigated, he found no violations of any kind. Barbara felt her face burning. She looked back at David again, expecting to see anger or annoyance, but his expression was thoughtful and even sympathetic. Moreover, Tom continued, David has been instrumental in helping our community avoid exactly the kind of neighbor disputes that tear communities apart. His advice has saved us thousands of dollars in legal fees. Bob Martinez nodded. Remember that mess with the Henderson family and their fence? David helped us resolve that in one meeting instead of dragging it through the courts for months. And the parking situation on Elm Street, Janet added. We were about to spend a fortune on new signage and enforcement, but David suggested a simple communication strategy that solved the whole problem. Barbara sat down heavily. Every board member was looking at her with expressions ranging from confusion to disappointment. She'd thought she was bringing an important issue to their attention, but instead she'd revealed herself as the problem resident they'd probably been hearing about. Barbara, Tom said gently, is there something specific about David's property that's causing you concern? Because from the board's perspective, he's been nothing but helpful to our community. Barbara opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could she explain that she'd spent a week trying to make life difficult for the man who'd been quietly helping their neighborhood solve its problems? David cleared his throat. If I may, he said, standing up, I think Mrs. Whitmore and I might have gotten off on the wrong foot. Sometimes when people don't have all the information about a situation, misunderstandings can develop. Barbara stared at him. Even now, when he had every right to be angry with her, David was giving her a way to save face. Perhaps, David continued, Mrs. Whitmore and I could sit down and discuss her concerns about the property. I'm always interested in hearing different perspectives about community issues. Tom looked relieved. That sounds like an excellent idea. David, would you be willing to work with Barbara on this? Of course, David said. I've found that most neighbor conflicts stem from communication problems rather than fundamental disagreements. Barbara felt tears prickling at her eyes. She'd spent days researching David's background, reading about his reputation for helping difficult residents, And here he was doing exactly what all those articles had described. Instead of embarrassing her or getting defensive, he was offering to help her. "I think," Barbara said quietly, "that I may have made some assumptions about the situation that weren't accurate." "That happens to all of us," David said kindly. "The important thing is being willing to learn from it." Tom moved on to other business, but Barbara barely heard any of it. She kept thinking about all the complaints she'd filed, all the government agencies she'd called, all the ways she'd tried to make David's life difficult, and he was offering to help her anyway. After the meeting ended, Barbara approached David as he was packing up his notes. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "I owe you an apology. I had no idea who you were or what you did for this community." David smiled. "You don't need to apologize for not knowing my resume, Mrs. Whitmore, but I would like to understand what concerns you have about the property. Maybe we can find some common ground." Barbara looked at this man who had every reason to dislike her, who could probably get her in serious trouble for harassment if he wanted to, and who was instead treating her with kindness and respect. "I would like that very much," she said. 3 days after the disastrous HOA meeting, Barbara Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, watching David work in his vegetable garden. She'd been meaning to walk over and talk to him, but every time she started toward his property, her courage failed her. Finally, she forced herself to make a move. She knocked on his front door at 10 in the morning, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and what remained of her pride. David answered the door in jeans and a t-shirt, dirt under his fingernails from his morning garden work. When he saw Barbara, his face lit up with a genuine smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, good to see you. Come on in." Barbara followed him into a house that was nothing like she'd expected. The inside was neat and comfortable, with family photos covering the mantel and bookshelves lining the walls. Everything was clean and well-maintained, a sharp contrast to her assumptions about how someone who kept a messy yard would live. "I brought these for you," Barbara said, holding out the plate of cookies. "It's not much, but I wanted to do something to apologize for how I've behaved." David accepted the cookies graciously. "That's very thoughtful of you. Would you like some coffee? I was just about to take a break from the garden." They sat at his kitchen table, and Barbara found herself looking out the window at his property from a completely different perspective. From inside the house, the tall grass and wildflowers looked intentional and peaceful. The old barn, weathered but solid, gave the whole place a sense of history and permanence. "I've been doing some research about you," Barbara admitted. "I found out about your company and all the work you do with communities." David nodded. "I figured you might. You strike me as someone who likes to have all the facts." "The thing is," Barbara continued, "reading about your work made me realize how badly I misunderstood this whole situation, and how badly I've been behaving." David poured coffee for both of them. "What made you feel like the property was such a problem in the first place?" Barbara thought about the question. It was the first time anyone had asked her to explain her motivations instead of just defending against her complaints. "I moved to this neighborhood 5 years ago," she said slowly. "It was the nicest place I'd ever been able to afford. I worked 2 jobs for years to save up for the down payment. When I finally got here, I felt like I'd made it, like I finally belonged somewhere nice." David listened without interrupting. "When I saw your property, with the tall grass and the old buildings, it scared me," Barbara continued. "I was afraid it would drag down the whole neighborhood. I was afraid my investment would lose value and I'd end up back where I started." "That makes sense," David said. "Fear about property values is one of the most common sources of neighbor conflicts I deal with." Barbara was surprised by his matter-of-fact response. "You don't think I was being ridiculous?" "I think you were trying to protect something important to you," David said. "The problem wasn't your concerns, it was the way you went about addressing them." Barbara felt her cheeks burn. "I called the police on you, and code enforcement, and animal control. I tried to get the neighbors to sign a petition against you." David chuckled. "You were certainly thorough. I'll give you credit for persistence. Aren't you angry about it?" David considered the question. "I was frustrated, especially when you called in false reports to various agencies. That wastes everyone's time and resources. But angry? Not really. I've seen this kind of thing before." He got up and pulled a book from one of his shelves. "This is a case study I wrote about a community in Oregon, where one resident filed over 100 complaints against neighbors in a single year." "Sound familiar?" Barbara winced. "What happened to them?" Once we figured out what was really driving the behavior, we were able to address it. The person wasn't malicious, they were just scared and didn't know how to communicate their needs effectively. What was driving it? Fear of change, mostly. They'd lived in the same house for 30 years, and the neighborhood was evolving around them. Instead of fighting the changes, we helped them find ways to be part of shaping them. Barbara thought about her own situation. The Meadowbrook development had indeed changed since she'd moved there. New families were moving in, some with different ideas about landscaping and home maintenance. Maybe her reaction to David's property was really about her discomfort with those changes. "Can I ask you something?" Barbara said. "Why do you keep your property the way you do? I mean, you obviously understand HOA standards better than anyone." David smiled. "That's a fair question. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather taught me that working with nature is usually better than fighting against it. The tall grass prevents erosion and provides habitat for birds and small animals. The old barn has historical value, and it's still structurally sound. The whole setup requires less water, less chemicals, and less maintenance than a traditional suburban landscape." Barbara looked out the window again. "I never thought about it that way. Most people don't, and that's okay. We all have different perspectives based on our experiences. The key is being willing to listen to each other." David showed Barbara around his property, explaining the thought process behind his choices. The overgrown areas were actually carefully managed native plant habitats. The deteriorating barn was regularly maintained and served as storage for his farm equipment. What Barbara had seen as neglect was actually a deliberate approach to sustainable land management. "The irony," David said as they walked back toward the house, "is that this kind of landscaping actually tends to increase property values over time. Native plants and sustainable practices are becoming more popular with buyers." "I feel like such an idiot," Barbara said. "Don't," David replied firmly. "You cared about your community and your investment. Those are good things. You just needed better information and a more effective approach." Over the following weeks, Barbara found herself learning more about sustainable landscaping and community relations. David lent her books and articles, and they had several long conversations about property management and neighbor relations. Barbara also started attending HOA meetings regularly, not to file complaints, but to actually understand how the community worked. She was amazed to discover how much thought and effort went into maintaining their neighborhood, and how many issues David had helped resolve behind the scenes. When the HOA decided to create a community garden, Barbara volunteered to help organize it. She worked with David to design a space that would bring residents together, while also serving as an educational opportunity about sustainable gardening practices. The project was a huge success. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before found themselves working side by side, sharing gardening tips and getting to know each other. Barbara discovered that several other residents had been interested in sustainable landscaping, but hadn't known how to get started. 6 months after their initial confrontation, Barbara was working in the community garden when she overheard 2 new residents talking about David's ranch property. "I don't understand why they let that place stay so messy," one of them said. "It really brings down the whole neighborhood." Barbara set down her gardening tools and walked over to them. "Actually," she said with a smile, "let me tell you about sustainable landscaping and why that property is actually one of our neighborhood's greatest assets," as she explained David's approach to land management and the benefits of native plant communities. Barbara realized how much she'd learned and grown over the past few months. She'd gone from being the neighborhood's biggest complainer to being an advocate for understanding and cooperation. That evening, Barbara knocked on David's door again, this time to invite him to a barbecue she was hosting for the community garden volunteers. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "not just for being patient with me when I was being awful, but for teaching me a better way to be part of this community." David smiled. "Thank you for being willing to learn and for helping other people understand different perspectives. That's exactly the kind of leadership communities need." As Barbara walked home, she reflected on how much her life had changed. She still cared about property values and community standards, but now she understood that those things were best protected through cooperation and understanding, not complaints and conflict. The security camera she'd installed to monitor David's property was long gone, replaced by bird feeders that attracted cardinals and blue jays to her yard. Her perfectly manicured lawn now included a section of native wildflowers that required less water and provided food for butterflies. Most importantly, Barbara had learned that being a good neighbor meant building relationships, not walls. And sometimes the people who challenge your assumptions are exactly the teachers you need most.